There we go. We do have a transcript going on too, so if for some reason you're not able to hear well, you can go ahead and read that. It's a live transcript, which sometimes has comical choices for words that one is not saying, but hey, that's fine. It's better than nothing, correct?
That's right.
All right. So again, I'm Jennifer. I am your host facilitator with Whole Foods Co-op in Duluth, Minnesota. It's my pleasure to have you in this class tonight. It's an honor to have John with us, who Fairhaven supplies the transplant plants that we sell at the co-op. So, and yes, Doug, this is being recorded. And eventually I will have a second to put my email address in the chat. Just for my sake, please email me directly and let me know that you're looking for the recording. It's too difficult for me to jump around and try to get your email addresses through the chat. So that is my preference. I'm also going to include the website for Whole Foods Co-op so you can see other classes that we offer. As I said before, we dial it back in the summer months. We don't do as many classes, but all of our movement classes will be continuing throughout the summer. So that's yoga twice a month, qigong twice a month, and sundo once a month. So there we go. If anybody has any difficulties with audio or visual, leave the class. I'll be monitoring the weight room, so I'll let you back in. And John said earlier, he is all about having an open communication and is pleased to take questions as they occur. So you can feel free to unmute, ask your question. And then please do mute back up again so that we don't have any distractions like phones ringing, dogs barking, things like that. All right. Kathy, if you wouldn't mind emailing me directly when I put my email into the chat, then I can get that to everybody and I don't have to try to collect everybody else's emails. So thank you so much. Okay. So that being said, thank you again to John. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and go silent so John can get started.
All right, great. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, and then I'm going to share my screen. I do have a little presentation together here. So let's see. We'll get that going here. All right. And I think I'm just going to keep it kind of in this. All right, everybody should be able to see this now. And Jen, if you wouldn't mind just helping me kind of monitor the chat, that would be good if folks are asking questions. So
sounds good.
All right, great. Okay, well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about growing and caring for tomatoes, kind of one of my favorite crops to grow. Let's see if I can, there we go. So I'll just start with a little kind of introduction. So I am John Beaton, and this is my wife, Emily, and she couldn't join us tonight, but she is also the co-owner of our farm, Fairhaven Farm. We are in Saginaw, Minnesota, so we're just north of Duluth. We operate our farm. We sell fresh vegetables primarily through our CSA program, and we also sell starter plants, which is another enterprise that we've been kind of developing over the past about 4 years. And it's been great because we have been able to work with the co-op to sell them the starter plants like this, which actually was kind of the provided the foundation of our of the starter plant enterprise. So we grow vegetables on about a half acre. Grow many different types of things, but tomatoes is kind of one of our a crop that we really focus on, something that I really love. And here's just an example of kind of what we bring to the co-op. Tomatoes are a big part of what we provide for the co-op. The picture on the right is kind of fun. We grew 1,200 tomato starts for every second grader in Duluth this year as a part of a farm to school initiative. And so that was really fun to kind of get kids involved with gardening. They took their little tomato plants and potted them up and cared for the little tomato plants. So the tomato is becoming a big part of our farm, and it's something we really enjoy. So as we go through tonight, here's just a little brief agenda. I'm going to speak very briefly about the history of the tomato, just to give you a little context. And then the tomato types and varieties. This, I think, is really critical to understand. It's going to give you some language so that you can understand the difference between the types of tomatoes and kind of so you can understand that. And then we'll go through our planting and our bed prep, kind of what we do at our farm. However, many of these things are applicable even to the home gardener, at least the basic principles. And the same things that we do, you can kind of scale up or down. And we'll talk a little bit about the actual growing and care for the tomatoes while they're growing throughout the season. And then we'll talk a little bit about saving seed. So, and then we'll have a little bit extra time at the end for kind of more questions. But like I said, if folks do have questions as we go through, please feel free to unmute and ask your question or type it in the chat. And that way we won't, and if you type it in the chat, we won't forget it. So, okay. So the tomato is kind of, something that we now think of as like this integral part to the garden. It's like, oh, it's one of those standard crops. But, I was doing a little research for this class and kind of, came to realize that it was actually only recently that the tomato became like popular in kind of North American gardens. And so it's kind of interesting. Okay, so the tomato itself originated in South America. They have, there still exist kind of wild counterparts to the now domesticated tomato plant in places like Chile and Peru. Kind of neat. And then the Spanish kind of, took the tomato plant, and as they found that growing, the indigenous people of South America were using the tomato plant. So when the Spanish kind of spread the growing of this tomato throughout the empire, their giant empire or whatever, and then in the early kind of 1700s, that's the first written account of the tomato plant in what would then have been kind of like the Florida area. But it wouldn't have been until like the late 1800s, once they started understanding how to breed and adapt the tomato plant, that it actually became like widely commercially available. And the many different varieties that we now know started to be bred and created. So then we'll go through the kind of types and varieties of the tomato plant. And so here are some key terms that we're going to keep coming back to. And this kind of knowledge has to kind of get stacked. The more we know about this, the more we'll know kind of later on, and especially when it gets to kind of the seed saving stuff, if folks are interested in saving seeds. So the first thing to understand when it comes to tomatoes, we have two types. We have a determinate and an indeterminate. Okay, so the indeterminate, this is something which will have continual growth and continual fruit production over a very long period of time. Essentially, as long as that tomato plant has the right conditions, it can continue to live and it can continue to grow. So this is primarily the type that we grow at our farm. I think almost all of the tomatoes that we provide the co-op are all indeterminates. In any kind of commercial production, greenhouse, hydroponic, all determinate, or indeterminate, sorry. And then the determinate varieties are, they kind of have a limited growth and concentrated harvest period. So they're gonna grow, reach a kind of a certain size over X amount of weeks, put on fruit, and ripen kind of in one go. And then the plants will start to kind of slow down and desiccate. So you kind of have continual growth or limited growth with a concentrated harvest period. Okay, so those are two types. Every tomato is either determinate or indeterminate. And then the other key terms are hybrid versus open pollinated. So open pollinated, this is something that, you know, you would refer to this as like it has stable genetics, and the seeds from that fruit, if you were to save those seeds from that fruit, it will be the same parent fruit. So if I've got a Brandywine tomato and I save those seeds, it will, and I save those seeds, plant them out again, it will be a Brandywine. And we'll talk more about specifics about that, but just know in general, the kind of open pollinated varieties are, you can easily save their seeds, and those seeds will be kind of true to type, the type of seeds, right, the seeds that come from open pollinated can be easily saved. And then we'll talk more about heirlooms on the next slide, but just understand that heirloom varieties are also open pollinated. All heirloom varieties are open pollinated. Not necessarily all open pollinated varieties are heirlooms, if that makes sense. Okay, and then the hybrid, and sometimes if you're shopping seed catalogs or on different seed websites, you'll see this F1 symbol. That just means it's the first generation of a cross pollination. So you're essentially taking two open pollinated plants, intentionally crossing them to get the dominant traits of each of the parent plants to manifest in a kind of hybrid offspring. So essentially hybrid is crossing two types to get the seed of the offspring, which will then that is what you are buying when you're buying hybrid seeds. And kind of the main thing here to understand is that if you're interested in saving seed, saving the hybrids is very difficult, because the fruit of a hybrid tomato, when you take those seeds and save those seeds, and if you planted those out, the resulting fruit will be, or the resulting plant will kind of revert back to one of the parents or some other kind of random combination of them. And so there's kind of like benefits to either type, but it's just kind of important to understand hybrid versus open pollinated when you're thinking about what varieties you want to grow and are selecting things for your garden.
Hey, hon.
And I'm seeing a couple questions. Let's see. Kate, you're asking about the dwarf varieties. So I don't have a kind of exhaustive list of many varieties. I have experience with the ones that we grow. However, I'm going to suggest a book at the end of the presentation, which has some really neat resources and also information about a recent breeding effort to get dwarf tomatoes. And then someone's asking about F2, F3. So this isn't, you would see, you as someone purchasing those seeds would never see an F2 or 3. If you were a breeder or someone who's, breeding your own varieties, may encounter that. It's just a way to keep track of the generations, because sometimes crosses are even more complex. It's like they cross 2 open pollinators to get a hybrid, and then that hybrid is crossed with another thing intentionally. Else. Like, so they're, again, not an expert on this. However, that symbol is important to understand. When you'll know what it means when you see it in the seed catalog, essentially. Yep, seed savers is great. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the heirlooms. And I think there is sometimes kind of confusion about what exactly an heirloom is. I think often folks think heirloom, they think open pollinated. And like I said, all heirlooms are open pollinated, but not necessarily not every open pollinated variety is an heirloom. And so I'll kind of explain the difference here. And so an heirloom plant simply is a variety with some value to its history, or it has a kind of history that's significant that we can trace. It has a story attached to it. It doesn't necessarily tell you anything about kind of how the plant grows, or it doesn't necessarily indicate organic versus non-organic, whatever. But when you hear heirloom, just understand that it has kind of a traceable story, or of like an interesting history that we can trace and understand due to the efforts of people, either professional breeders or people in their kind of home gardens that have saved seeds. And in that sense, there is kind of 2 categories of hybrids. There are like family heirlooms with kind of interesting histories, something like the Brandywine, or non-hybrid varieties that were developed by seed companies. And I put on this 1950 date because around the late 40s and the early 1950s was when the first hybrids were developed. And then once that occurred, the hybrids became extremely popular. They were found in seed catalogs, and just kind of the hybrid thing kind of became the norm, and for many reasons, because, it was easier because the seed company, well, if they make a hybrid, they're selling you the traits of that hybrid, and you can't save the seeds, so you have to buy the seeds every year. So they kind of popularized, the hybrid tomato. However, prior to that, there were seed companies breeding tomatoes, but that was done with a different process. You're not cross-pollinated intentionally. You're growing out a large population of a given variety, and then you're selecting based, let's say I grow 100 plants. You're going to go through all of those 100 plants. They're all going to be relatively genetically the same. However, with everything in nature, there are kind of genetic mutations that manifest. So out of a population of 100 plants, they would go and find the strongest 1 or 2 or 3 and save the seeds exclusively from that strongest plant. And kind of over time, you are kind of selecting, slowly over time, you're selecting for the traits that are manifesting kind of more or less randomly. Whereas the hybrid, they've kind of, through experiments and research, they figured out, I cross these two, the offspring will reliably be this new type. So it's just interesting to put on that 1950 date, just because that's when the hybrids started to become popular. And then, thank goodness for entities like Seed Savers, who are continuing to carry on the history and the stories of these other heirloom varieties. I've also got someone asking about indeterminate versus determinate being equivalent to bush versus vine tomatoes. This is Doug asking this question. So I think so. I think that a determinate tomato would be referred to as like a bush tomato, because often they're not pruned, they get big, and they kind of turn into a bush, as opposed to the vine tomato, which would be indeterminate. Often they're just cared for in a different way, and the vine is emphasized more. And so here's just a couple of our varieties that we grow here at the farm. We've got a couple standards that we grow all the time that are super popular. Number one is the Sun Gold cherry, super sweet, highly recognizable, and everyone's favorite. We grow about 4 times more Sun Gold tomatoes than any other kind, because people love the Sun Gold. And actually the Sun Gold is a hybrid variety, so difficult to save the seeds from this. We have the Sweetie and Black Cherry, both open pollinated, nice varieties. The Brandywine, this is kind of another one that comes to mind when you think popular varieties. A giant, beautiful slicer. Sometimes you'll find in different seed companies will have different strains of Brandywine. So one, they kind of have a different origin. Cherokee Purple, the German Johnson, the Orange Flame, Black Crim, Green Zebra. So this is our kind of rotating cast between the Brandywine and the Green Zebra. These we actually are growing on our farm. And now we're going to start I'm going to start my own seed saving efforts here at the farm, so that we can actually test the growth of these different open pollinated heirloom varieties. Make sure that that we have got a quality seed, and then make efforts to save those seeds, so that we can kind of just have a more resilient stock of seeds that we can grow, and that we can grow as starter plants, and that we can grow as fresh tomatoes as well. And then we got a couple other standard paste tomatoes, which are fun, the San Marzano, Amish paste, and the Roma. So all great. Okay, so I'll pause for just a minute. It's tough to answer specifics about specific varieties if I haven't grown it, because there are over 10,000 tomato varieties and I have not grown them all. But I'll pause for 1 minute just to see if there's any questions about hybrid versus open pollinated or heirloom or anything like this. Evelyn's asking, what's the sweetest tasting variety? And that one is an easy answer. That one always comes down to the Sun Gold. People seem to really enjoy that one. That's almost like the candy of the tomato world. So if you're looking for a sweet one, that's it. Okay, so we'll move on, and we'll keep going into the planting and the bed prep, because this is like this is a critical part about getting a good tomato. Sometimes folks blame the variety, and certainly the variety and type of tomato that you're choosing will influence the the success of the tomato. However, I think it's really important to understand the conditions that tomato is growing in, and just kind of some general principles about what the tomato wants, because then you can kind of increase your chances for success. So first, we can't have this conversation without talking a little bit about soil health. And so what I mean by this is thinking about preparing your beds, but not necessarily thinking about which fertilizer to use, but thinking about some basic soil health principles. And the most important thing that I've learned as a professional grower, even in just the last few years, is the importance of the soil biology. So in this sense, I want you all to think about feeding the soil and understand the plant has its needs, right? But we're going to focus, if we're looking at our entire garden, we're going to focus on feeding the soil. And what I mean by that is feeding the soil biology. And so if we think about the soil, it's not just kind of elements and minerals present in the soil. The most important component is the biology itself. So it's the millions of bacteria and fungi and other single-celled organisms working up to insects and nematodes, an incredible diversity of living creatures live in the soil. And it is them that is doing the work to deliver nutrients to your plant. So it's important to think about the soil. If you think about the soil as if it was your stomach, if it was your digestive system, because if you think about your digestive system, when you consume food, what's happening is your biology, the biology that lives inside you and inside your gut, is breaking down the food, and the byproduct of that happening, right? The waste product, if you want to think about it that way, the waste product of the biology that lives inside you is what is the nutrients that are being delivered to your body. And so the soil operates in the exact same way. And the food for the soil is carbon, right? Or it's sometimes referred to as organic material, right? So if you think about the forest, when the leaves fall on the ground in the forest, and over time those things are layered up, the biology is literally digesting those leaves. Those leaves are carbon material, and the byproduct or the waste product of those that biology breaking down that carbon material is the nutrients that your plants are uptaking. So that's important to think about and understand when it comes to prepping your garden. And I'll show you in the next couple slides kind of what we do, and we'll keep coming back to that point that we're taking care of the biology. Okay, another thing to remember when it comes to tomatoes, all crops in the garden, but tomatoes specifically, is practicing good crop rotation. So making sure that the same plant isn't planted in the same, the same type of plant isn't planted in the same place year after year. Tomatoes in particular have a tendency to have kind of disease build up in the soil. And often the problems that affect tomatoes are soil-borne diseases. So it's important to remember that. Many of those things, like I say, are soil-borne, okay, and many of those are fungal in nature, so fungal related diseases. So one thing we're experimenting with on our farm is breaking up that disease cycle, or that fungal based disease pathogens, with a brassica based cover crop. After we plant our tomatoes, in the fall we will plant brassicas. So things like the brassica family is cabbage, broccoli, collards, Brussels sprouts, things like this. But in a cover crop situation, you'd be using like mustard and radish, because the brassica actually has like an antifungal effect on the soil. So we're experimenting with that on our farm to break the disease cycle, which is semi-inevitable when it comes to tomatoes when grown on a big scale. But another thing, in contrast to the negative fungus that can sometimes affect our tomatoes, is the mycorrhizal fungi, which is a beneficial fungus, which actually enhances the growth of the tomato plant. So if I can't spend too much time on that tonight, but if folks are interested in researching this yourself, Googling this, you can actually buy water-soluble mycorrhizal, which is it's essentially a fungus. It will never produce like a mushroom, like you think about when you think of a fungus. It's simply an organism which will create a kind of relationship with the roots of many types of plants, including the tomato, especially the tomato. And when that mycorrhizal fungi builds a relationship with the tomato roots, it's almost as though the roots have kind of expanded because of as that fungal network grows and expands, it has this relationship with the roots of the tomato plant. And so the mycorrhizal can actually scavenge nutrients from farther away than the tomato plant's roots can reach. And as the fungus kind of lives with that tomato plant root, it can uptake those nutrients that the fungus is also searching for. So just understand that the mycorrhizal, it's almost as if the roots are increasing in size due to this relationship. So the mycorrhizal we have found tremendous success with on our farm, and we inoculate through a water-soluble mycorrhizal solution all of our tomato plants on our farm. Someone's asking, when do you add the mycorrhizal? And that's right either at the seedling stage. Sometimes potting mix will have this if you search for that, or right at planting. If you have a water-soluble form of mycorrhizal, it comes in a powder. You can literally mix, and it takes a very, very small amount just to create kind of a solution in that water. And then you just simply water in your tomato plants when you've planted them. Or you can dunk as you pull the plant out of its pot, you can dunk those roots in that water and plant it in the ground. And then you have inoculated it with this mycorrhizal fungi. So, and then the other thing to understand is that the tomato plant is, when compared to the other plants in the garden, it is what I would consider a heavy feeder. So it is very, it does require quite a bit of nutrients to have a strong, healthy plant that will thrive as long into the season as possible. And those nutrient needs do evolve over time. So, so when you're first planting, we put down compost, but we also do include a type of fertilizer. Just because we're at a commercial scale, we need these plants to thrive, and we plant very intensively. So we make sure that fertilizer includes primarily nitrogen and potassium. A slow release nitrogen is great. Something that is great for the home gardener that you can find quite easily that we have used in the past is composted chicken manure. Oftentimes this comes in kind of like a pellet form. And this is a great nitrogen source for the plants. And it also contains calcium, which is critical to having good solid tomato fruit. And then as the tomato, you kind of have two growth stages. You have the initial growth when the tomato is growing, upon initial transplant. So there you want to make sure that there's enough potassium and nitrogen to get strong root system and to encourage it to grow vigorously. However, when it starts to set fruit, when it starts to form tomatoes and you see the flowers open and they become pollinated, then it's going to require more phosphorus. And so all of this can be kind of confusing. So, but on a home gardener scale, you can think about it as there's a kind of a fertilizer, good compost and fertilizer that will go in upon initial planting. And then wait about 3-4 weeks, wait till it starts setting fruit, and then do another light application. And sometimes you can get away with just using that. It might be that same all-purpose fertilizer or something that might tend towards a higher phosphorus content. So, but we can't because everyone's garden is kind of different. I can't provide exact recommendations. Everyone's soil is kind of different, so I can't provide exact recommendations. But just know that because the tomato is a long season crop, it's going to be in your garden all summer. Some kind of second feeding is going to be good. You can't. It's not a kind of a one and done if you want to maximize that tomato and have it be the best that it can be. The only other kind of exception to that is if you're growing in pots or containers, you're going to want to find a fertilizer that you can kind of regularly apply, because in growing in a pot or a container, that plant is going to uptake and use those nutrients much quicker than in a field setting. Okay, so now I'll walk you through a little bit about our bed prep. Now, keeping in mind, we are on kind of a commercial scale. However, if you look at what we're doing, you can kind of understand the basic principles behind what we're doing here. And what we practice at our farm, like I say, we grow on about 1/2 acre, and so we're growing very intensely. We're growing very intensely on a very small space. But the nice thing about that is that what we're doing can be scaled up or down depending on the space you have available if you're in a home gardening situation. So if you look at our beds, now we are in a high tunnel structure. Okay, so and I'll talk more specifics about that when we get to the growing and the care for the live plant. But just know that protecting that plant in some way is going to yield better results. However, you can find success growing outside, but in our northern climate, it is a little bit more difficult for the plant that originates from South America to grow. So it's kind of like the tomato is the one type of plant the one plant in the garden that you might want to think about if you're in a colder climate, kind of giving it all the help it can get. So we're in a high tunnel situation, but the bed prep is essentially the same for outside or inside. So what you're looking at right now is 30-inch wide beds with wood chipped walking paths. Wood chip helps support that positive fungal networks. And when we prep our beds, we actually do not till these beds. This is the 3rd season that we have not tilled, and we're having great success with this method. And so you'll see though, in our beds, what we'll do, the initial step is taking we use like a broad fork, which is a large kind of fork implement, but you can just use a standard garden fork just to simply loosen that soil. So you drive the tines, rock that back and forth a little bit just to open up the soil, especially in the springtime. You're letting the soil breathe. You're introducing oxygen into the soil. You're allowing water to kind of percolate deeper into the soil. And then after that, we apply compost. So the compost is acting, like I said before, as our carbon source and our source of biology, because that is a critical component of the compost. When you put down good compost, you're introducing organic material and biology, so living organisms that are going to populate your soil. Okay, and then we simply just kind of take a rake and we rake that nice and smooth, so we get good kind of soil tilth, and it's looking, the aggregate is really nice. Okay, so once we do that initial prep, we're also applying that fertilizer. Like I say, we have a like I said, we've used a composted chicken manure in the past with great success. We are trying a different product this year. This comes from, it's composted turkey manure. I'll type this in the chat in case folks are interested. It's a great organic product. It's called Sustain. It's not spelt the same way as the word sustain, but this is Sustain. And you may have a local distributor to find the retail version of this, but this is like a commercial organic fertilizer, very well balanced. The nutrient content is a 464 for your understanding there. Okay, so now we've got our beds prepped, and then we'll put down our drip tape, which makes up our irrigation system for how we irrigate the tomatoes. Because tomatoes, they like, the tomatoes kind of, there again, we're going to build a structure around this thing. We're going to devote more resources to this particular plant. We're going to try to kind of give it the best in order to get good results. So the tomato likes regular watering, but not super saturated soils. It doesn't like to grow in wet soil, doesn't like to grow in cold soil. And if you can somehow, whether that's going out with your gardening can every morning before it gets warm and watering kind of, equal portions each morning, or if you're in a situation where you can set up a drip system, maybe you have raised beds, this drip system there again can be kind of scaled to any size. They sell versions that can go in like a raised bed, and it all operates on just normal kind of home water pressure and everything. So whether it's automated or some kind of routine you build, that tomato plant will thrive under kind of regular watering, because so much of that tomato plant is water. And you think about the tomato, it's almost all water. And so you'll encounter some problems if the water is sporadic, or it goes through a long drought, or it's saturated for a long time. So just keep that in mind, is that the tomato likes regular watering, it likes routine. Okay. So now, once that drip tape is in place, we put down our landscape fabric. And this is a woven plastic that we can use for many, many years. It doesn't degrade or break down. And what this does is it keeps the soil warm. So there again, in our cold climate, having that nice warm soil is important for the tomato plant. It will help it thrive. And it also helps us basically eliminate all weeding in our high tunnel. And so there again, you can think about this for your home garden. It's just a smaller piece of fabric. So just understand it likes warm roots, regular watering. And then in our case, like I said before, we're growing all indeterminate varieties, which means they will continue to grow. And so what we do is we take and we trellis these onto the twine, and then we do regularly prune these plants in order to maximize our production. But what you're seeing here, you can practice at home, but what you're seeing here is kind of plants that are growing upright. You can see there's good airflow underneath. The plant leaves don't like to be wet. And when wet leaves kind of rub up and touch one another, that also kind of spreads, is a vector for disease spreading. So we like to have really good airflow around these plants. And pretty soon they will get taller than us. That's awesome. This is why I love this crop. It's so fun to watch it grow, and it's more labor intensive, but it's great. If you enjoy it, it's great. And so, and then you kind of maximize your production and you get some good looking tomatoes there. So tips on pruning. Yeah, let's see. I'll get right into that. Okay, so now we got our growing and care. So how do we care for these plants as they grow? So here's a couple guiding principles. Some of them I've already mentioned. Okay, we're going to keep the soil warm, keep the leaves dry, good airflow, and pruning. Okay, so now you have different options, and it's all up to the individual gardener on how much time, energy, and effort you want to put into this. You can get very intensive, and if you have some kind of infrastructure in your garden, which will allow you to kind of wrap a piece of twine around that single, we call it a single leader, that single stem going straight up, you can do that. And you can prune what they're called suckers. So as if you think about the tomato plant as one long vine, every time a branch or a leaf comes out, there's the elbow. And at every elbow juncture, there will be a little sucker, a little, it will try to make another vine. So what we do when we trellis is we prune those off and we make it so that it's one vine. However, if you're in a setting where, that's not realistic, or you don't want to go down that route, you're planted in a cage or something, the tomato cage. I would say just in general, looking at the plant and trying the best you can just to prune around the edges, prune around the base a little bit. If you see damaged leaves, yellow leaves, any kind of discoloration beginning, normally it happens from the bottom up. If you see kind of discoloration happening on those leaves, if you prune those off, it's going to help the health of that plant. It will stop that disease from spreading up into the rest of the plant. And it will help the plant save energy from trying to repair those leaves. So you're just kind of like helping it along. And then if you also prune, if you prune to some extent, right, you're kind of just encouraging the plant to set fruit. Its mission is to set fruit and go to seed. So you're just kind of helping to encourage it to fruit more. And I'm seeing someone ask a question, how do you know if it's determinate or indeterminate? That is something that you have to look up when you're buying the seeds. It will list that at the different seed companies, the catalogs you're looking through. It should list, is it determinate or indeterminate? Okay, and I talked about regular watering. Oh, there's our the watchdog, making sure we're doing everything right. I just put this on here, one, because the dog's kind of cute, but also because there again, you can see through the bottom, right? We've pruned and we've trimmed up the bottom branches. If you are doing this twine type system, if you're pruning it to a single vine, you can see all the places that we pruned off, and these are just leaves and the suckers that off. And we prune, if you're doing it intensely like this, we prune to the first fruit cluster, and then we let it go and just concentrate on removing the individual suckers. So some of these, it's difficult to give a good example. I wish you all were in my greenhouse, but if you're kind of taking notes and if you look up pruning tomatoes, removing suckers, there's many resources on the internet for that. And then I'm going to show you a great book that you can look at too for more information. Okay, so before I move on, I will pause again. Does anybody have any other questions about caring for the tomato? Pruning, what tomatoes like, what they don't like. I think what I like most about the tomato is that it does demand more attention in the garden. Some things you kind of set and forget. I like the squash plant for the exact opposite reason. I put the squash in the ground and it goes crazy and it grows and it always produces fruit. You don't even have to think about it. But the tomato, it requires your kind of attention and it asks a lot of you. And if you kind of work with it, you can build this relationship with the plant. I really like it. Okay, so now let's see. Thoughts on hanging plants upside down. I think that's with certain varieties, you might find that in a garden center and they've selected a variety that will work for that. When they hang them upside down and it kind of grows and then it wants to curve up. So I don't know if there's any true benefit or if that's going to make a better plant or not. It's kind of like a novelty, the hanging the plants upside down. Maybe you're tight on space and you want to do that. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings on the weird upside down things. Special way to plant. That's a good question. So Ed is asking, is there a special way to plant? So like I say, I think the soil prep is important. If you're making sure that where you're going to plant that tomato, the soil has kind of been loosened so that the plant, the roots aren't hitting kind of like a compacted layer. They're not in super compacted soil. And you've got good compost mixed in there, a little bit of fertilizer, right? So, and then you're going to take that tomato and you're going to plant it. It kind of depends on the plant you're working with, but the tomato will allow you to plant it almost as deep as you can, right? You don't want to kind of all of the plant, but like, let's say you've got a 3-inch pot that it's growing in. You've got a 3-inch kind of square of roots. You can plant that tomato, much deeper than 3 inches if it is like long and tall, because the stem that goes underground will begin to sprout roots. You might have noticed that if you've ever had a tomato plant where maybe a branch leans down and touches the ground, wherever that plant touches, it will start to sprout roots. The plant is kind of amazing in this way because the cells of the plant, the tissue of the plant is prepared to be wherever it is. So if it's exposed to the air, it will turn into a stem. It will be a stem. If it's exposed to the soil, if it's touching the soil, roots will sprout from that same place. So you can bury the plant pretty deep. And then when you do that, you're actually, you're increasing that potential root mass as well. So that's the only thing I'm thinking about, any, special way to plant. Let's see, how to prune. Kit is asking how to prune when the plant is really producing. Is it okay to cut off branches that don't have flowers? Yeah, I mean, to some extent, certainly you can prune when the plant is producing. We certainly do that. I just wouldn't go overboard, right? You want to make sure that there's enough leaves there to photosynthesize so the plant is healthy. The other thing you might watch out for and think about is that if that ripening tomato is exposed to too much intense sunlight, this happens maybe a little bit more in a greenhouse situation, but it can happen outside. If too much of that ripening tomato is exposed to the sunlight, you will get sun scald around the top or wherever the sun's hitting too intensely. It'll just kind of get mushy and gross. So you kind of have to just find the middle way when it comes to pruning. You don't want to overdo it and leave it with no leaves. But even in a situation where you might be growing in a kind of like a cage, and you're just letting the plant go wild, if you just look at it, kind of spend some time with the plant and understand these basic principles of, you want dry leaves, good airflow. I mean, those two essentially should tell you, okay, I'm going to remove a couple of these branches because it looks like all the leaves are jammed up on the interior of this cage. Maybe I'll kind of prune it a little bit so that it's got more room to breathe. So it's just finding the balance when it comes to pruning and experimenting as well, because many of the varieties, Indeterminate or Determinate, I mean, each variety of tomato is different and has slightly different growth habits. Some are more bushy and some do tend to stay more to a single vine. So you're just finding the balance with the pruning. I think that's the most important thing. And someone's asking about growing tomatoes indoor. Can you successfully grow tomatoes indoors? I know it's possible. I have never done that. I think there's a little bit more science to it. I think that you'd have to be really careful with your nutrients that you're delivering to it, because when you remove it from the soil, it doesn't have the ability to scavenge for those nutrients by growing bigger roots. So you have to introduce those nutrients. So you can grow it indoors successfully, certainly, but I think it'd be more challenging. I guess that it's not impossible, but it'll be more challenging. And then Ed is also asking, should you lay the stem down when planting? Well, you could, if the stem is, I mean, right now, or some of the plants that we planted here, let me put it this way, we planted some of them a little bit too early, and they're very long, really long. I've seen some people actually dig a trench. If you've got a super long tomato and you only want that much exposed above ground when you plant it, I've seen people actually dig a trench, lay it in the trench, and have maybe 10 inches or something above the soil line, and the rest they've actually dug in a trench and kind of covered with soil. So basically, whatever part of that plant you bury, it's going to turn into roots. Let's just say that. Okay. So now I've got a little bit about seed saving. If folks are interested in this, this is kind of cool, because the neat thing about the tomato plant, in that it is difficult and kind of challenging to grow. Well, it's difficult and challenging to master. Let me say that. it's not very difficult to grow, but it's difficult to master, like many things. However, the seed saving is actually quite easy, because the tomato plant self-pollinates about 90% of the time, which means that the kind of pollen from an individual flower kind of will pollinate itself. So like when a bee visits the flower, it's kind of, there's a chance of cross-pollination, right? But from what I've read, it's about 90% of the time that flower will self-pollinate, which means when you save the fruit of a tomato and save those seeds and grow them out, it will be the variety that you took the fruit from, with very little chance of cross-pollinating with other varieties, which means that you can grow a dozen different varieties of tomatoes in the same place, and you can still kind of like collect fruit and have the seeds from that fruit be the same variety as its parent plant. So there's not going to be a Brandywine crossing with a Roma. Is there a chance of that? Yes, unless you're very intentional about it and you yourself pollinate individual flowers and kind of like keep that little flower cluster protected. That's the extreme side. But if you're kind of just into this for fun, and you just want to keep saving seeds at a basic kind of level, it's pretty simple. And which is how all many of the what we think of as heirloom varieties, this is how many of them have got to us. It's simply home gardeners growing their favorite type and saving the seeds that come from those tomatoes. So the only thing to remember when it comes to seed saving is that you want to make sure that you do have an open pollinated variety. Remember, like what we talked about last time. And there again, this information will be clear in the seed catalog that you are purchasing your seed from. Or like in our case, we have a growing guide that's available to our customers at the co-op. And if they look in there, we have written information about if you're buying the starter plants. Sometimes the nurseries, if you're buying from another nursery, they might know about this. That's kind of what we specialize in. We don't grow a ton of ornamental flowers and different things like a normal nursery. We emphasize the vegetables and really enjoy the tomatoes. So we do have a better understanding about that. But if that plant is also labeled an heirloom, remember that all heirlooms are open pollinated. So you can know that you can safely save those seeds, or easily kind of save those seeds. And so let's say you're planting a population, right? You're planting 6 plants, and let's just pretend they're all the same variety. So what you're going to do is, this is important. You have to observe the plant and understand, kind of think to yourself, what are the traits that I'm looking for? If I grow 6 plants of the same variety and one of the 6 happens to ripen earlier than all the rest, maybe I'm going to keep an eye on that one. I'm going to tag that one. Or maybe one has bigger fruit or whatever qualities or characteristics that are important to you. You got to keep an eye on that plant, tag that somehow. And then when the plant finally produces its fruit and the tomato becomes fully ripe, you don't want to let it go longer on the vine. You want to get that tomato when it's perfectly ripe. And then you're going to harvest the fruit from that single plant. I'm trying to think of an easy way to say this, because you could go down, we could have an entire presentation on just seed savings and the complexity of seed saving and breeding plants and different things like this. But just in general, rather than or let's say this, if you're going to collect seed from multiple plants, like let's say I've got six Brandywines all growing, and I want to save, I like 2 plants. I'm going to save seeds from one, and I'm going to keep those seeds separate. Harvest, 1 or 2 fruits from that one plant. I'm going to keep that separate from the other one. Just for your kind of own record keeping, and because you wouldn't want to take one fruit from each of the 6 plants, because when you plant those out, then you're going to have a random assortment of qualities that you're trying to select for. So if I like this one because it produces early, I'm going to select 2 fruit from that one single plant, and hopefully kind of encourage, or hopefully that kind of characteristic will carry on to its offspring. But it's very simple. Okay, we're going to take that ripe fruit, cut it open. You're going to, you can obviously keep the flesh, but you're going to take the seeds, scrape the seeds, and all of it's kind of like, it has kind of like a jelly type coating on it. You're going to kind of scrape those off. You can obviously eat the flesh, use it for something, and put the seeds plus its kind of jelly coating, and mix in just a tiny amount of water. Stir that up, introduce a little bit of oxygen to that, and then you're going to let it sit for several days. Kind of varies on the conditions. Like if it's really hot where you are, it's going to go faster, but if it's kind of colder, it'll go slower, because what's happening is those seeds and the coating around those seeds are actually going to ferment over the next several days. It could take up to 5 or 6 days. And you're going to notice kind of like a white kind of growth, kind of like, almost looks like kind of like a moldy kind of white growth. And that's the seeds, the coating around the seeds kind of fermenting and helping to break down that kind of jelly type coating. And it's also helping to kind of preserve the seeds, because if you think about it, when that fruit, if these plants are growing out in the wild, that fruit is going to drop to the ground and start rotting, and all of that, the material inside the fruit, the little jelly coating, all that stuff is actually going to help the seed germinate. It's going to provide nutrient to the seed as it germinates. So what you're doing by fermenting it is kind of removing that from the equation. So you're kind of, it'll make the seed store better by going through this kind of fermentation process. So what I do is I'll just use a simple little plastic cup. You label it so that you know the type and what year. If you're going to do this on the regular, keep track of what year it's from. Stir it up, put a piece of paper towel or like a porous cloth on top so that it can breathe a little bit. And then, maybe stir that thing once a day. And then watch for that reaction. Watch for this kind of white kind of growth on top. And once that happens, then you can take and put your seeds in like a strainer, fine mesh strainer, and just rinse them really well. And all of that kind of extra coating and kind of gel stuff will slide off the seed and come off the seed. So then you're just gonna, so now you have rinsed seeds, and you're just gonna take and kind of sprinkle those the best you can on a piece of newspaper. I find that works really, really well. And let that just dry in kind of like a, not in sunlight, but like a kind of cool, dark, dry location with some good airflow. And then once they dry out, you can kind of, the seeds will be a little stuck together. You can kind of crinkle them in your fingers to get them to all be individual seeds. But then that's all it takes. And so now, and then if you think about that, I mean, one tomato plant or one tomato will yield hundreds of seeds. And then now you can start saving them year after year as well. Another reason why we also focus on the open pollinated and heirloom varieties that we sell, because now you can take them into your own home garden, and you can kind of save your own seeds as well. And let's see. I think that's what I have on seed saving. I'll pause again for a minute to see if there's questions here. There's our picture. There's the seeds. So we're getting close to our time here. So I will kind of open it up now just in general for folks if they do have any questions just about anything we've discussed tonight. I know we've discussed a lot, and the tomato there again is kind of like a type of plant that some growers, that's the only thing they grow, so it's very intense. But let's see, what do we got here? Deborah. Let's see. Deborah's asking, if you bought tomatoes, would it be possible to save those seeds? So probably, but like if you're buying just the fruit itself in the grocery store, then you have no idea what that variety is or what it's going to be, or if it's a hybrid. So in theory, you could save the seeds and plant them out, but you just won't know what you're going to get. Okay. Pat is asking, why are most store-bought tomatoes less tasty than the ones sold many years ago? Well, I think the simple answer there is that, tomatoes now, produced on a commercial scale are, when they're selecting and breeding the tomato plants, they're breeding for plants that transport well rather than taste well. So that's something interesting too to understand, is that when you buy store-bought tomatoes, I'll just give the example. We live in northern Minnesota. And so when I go to the grocery store and there's tomatoes there year round, most of the time those are coming from very far away. And most of the time, those tomatoes are being picked underripe. They're being picked kind of green still. And then in transport, they are kind of sprayed with a type of ethylene gas, which encourages them to ripen in transport. So all of the kind of tastes and texture and flavors and things that would normally manifest when that fruit has enough time to ripen on its own on the vine, it's just kind of being forced to do that. And you get kind of just a wimpy tomato that's just kind of tasteless. So it's just kind of the difference in our food system now, and this is also why I love tomatoes, especially being in northern Minnesota, is that, to me, this is like a luxury item. This is like something amazing. This is something that you can't find in stores. Some of these varieties, like the Brandywine, okay, here's the exact opposite of a store-bought tomato. The Brandywine has been bred exclusively for taste and texture. And the result is that the skin is so delicate that it's impossible to ship. It would be bruised and be mush, kind of, no matter where it's going, even if it's difficult for, to bring it down the street, so it's kind of like this thing that you get to enjoy right when it's there. You didn't have it 2 weeks ago, you have it for this several week period, and you're not going to have it again for another, the winter time. So to me, that's why the tomato brings me joy, because it's this kind of thing that's super special, and it's only there for a little while. That's what I like about it. And then there's so many different varieties that if you really get into it, you can kind of experiment and explore different varieties for your entire life. So I really like the tomato. Okay, let's see. A couple more questions here. Okay, Kit is asking, do you have to add anything to the soil to prevent blossom end rot, or just spray with rot stop once? Is there a better product? Yeah, well, the blossom end rot can come from several things, and so it's kind of you have to kind of think about the conditions that you're in and where you're at. Sometimes that blossom end rot can come from irregular watering, right? It can come from a long drought period and then doused with water. It's gonna kind of, when that fruit is forming, for whatever reason, that tissue responds, it can't handle this giant swing and watering. And so that will form that blossom end rot, which is just kind of like the fruit itself kind of desiccating or breaking down at the kind of on the bottom. And also some varieties tend towards that blossom end rot as well. So you might kind of think about trying to get a variety that doesn't have that blossom end rot happen a lot. A lot of the time, the tomatoes with like a pointy bottom will have that end rot more. Like this variety called Speckled Roman, or like even the San Marzano. It's kind of that is a challenging one to grow because it has a pointy tip and it does tend to get that blossom end rot. So, and that's the thing with kind of different diseases. I had a kind of thing about diseases and dealing with that kind of prepared, but I found it would be extremely difficult to try to kind of say, here's the one solution. I wish it was that easy, but so many times it comes down to the condition that the tomato is growing in that influences the kind of disease. Now here in northern Minnesota, the kind of decay of the tomato is inevitable, the plant itself. So it's kind of like, it's more about kind of like disease mitigation than eradication. So like eventually the plant will get this kind of fungal action happening on its leaves will turn yellow and the plant will slowly die. Like that's just what happens to the plants here. So you're just kind of mitigating that. And there again, those principles of good airflow, keeping the leaves dry, is kind of a good principle. And then someone else is asking, Denny is asking, why you shouldn't wet the foliage. Fertilizer company that encourages foliage watering. Now that's certainly applicable. Okay, so maybe let me elaborate on this. You can, right? If you're going to do a foliar feeding, you got a liquid fertilizer and you're going to do a foliar feeding, like there's kind of like a time and a place that's appropriate. So like if you're going to do a foliar feeding, it's best to do that kind of early in the morning or kind of in the evening when at dusk, when there's not bright hot sun, because it's just gonna, that plant is it's just kind of stressing the plant out a little bit to get that, right? And it's trying to absorb that nutrient, whatever your kind of liquid solution, it's absorbing that slowly through the leaves too. So you run the risk of, if you do a foliar feeding during the afternoon in full sun, that kind of chemical or mineral in that foliar kind of liquid fertilizer is going to stay on top of the leaf. It might kind of burn the leaves a little bit. So yeah, if you're going to do a foliar feeding, you can do that, but just make sure that it's kind of like in the morning or in the evening. And remember that this is like a principle. So it's kind of like you're doing that, but you're being intentional about that. It's not like that plant, the leaves are like wet all the time, or you're like watering them all the time. And then the other thing too, just to remember, like the tomato will respond to really hot conditions. It will wilt during the day. So the plant will kind of droop a little bit, but to truly know if that plant kind of needs to be revived or needs immediate help, it's kind of like, you got to wait till the evening time to see if those leaves perk back up, because it's just a response. In hot, dry conditions, the leaves are going to wilt a little bit. That's totally fine. Okay, let's see. Pat is asking when we have our tomatoes for sale at the Whole Foods Co-op. We've got them there right now. You can find them there right now. In fact, I'm going to be tabling at the both co-op locations tomorrow. So you can find me at the Hillside location, ask any questions or kind of come meet me, hang out. I believe, Jen, you got to help me out. What time am I there at the Hillside location?
So you start, you start at 11 o'clock at Hillside. So it's 11 to, I think it's 11 to 1. And then you move over to Denfeld at 3 o'clock.
Yep, 3 to 5 at Denfeld.
Yep.
So, yep. I've got it written down somewhere, so don't worry, I won't forget, but it's hard for me to keep track of time when it's farming season. Okay, planting inside and raised beds, minimum temp outside. You know, it depends if you're covering them at all. You know, if you're covering them and you can kind of mitigate those overnight temps a little bit, you know, you're going to want to be around 45, 50 degrees. You know, the warmer, the better, right? So if you're trying to get success for only a few plants, it's actually better to kind of hold off a little bit till the conditions are right to plant the plant, rather than thinking you're going to get way ahead and plant the plant too early, because it's going to be kind of stressed out and stunted a little bit as it tries to deal with those cold temps. We plant into our high tunnel. Our tomatoes are planted right now and have been for a week. But we have a little bit higher temps in that tunnel. We also have that landscape fabric down, which is actively warming that soil during the day. So we have slightly different conditions. Yeah, okay. And so before we end, I want to show you this book. This is an awesome book. Much of my knowledge and wisdom comes from this. A lot of it's, like I say, it's kind of like, you know, this particular author has devoted his entire life to understanding tomatoes, what they need, what they want, how to save the seed, all of these things like this. So it's like, comes to a garden setting, you plant many things, right? That's one whole kind of set of understanding. But then you get down to tomatoes, you'd spend your entire life learning about them. So this guy has created a really awesome book called Epic Tomatoes. He works closely with seed savers in Iowa to create this book, and it's really cool. So if you're into tomatoes and you want to learn more, not be super overwhelmed, it's not super scientific, it's got great pictures, talks about the history more in depth. You can learn about tons of different varieties and a little bit more about tomatoes. That's a great book. So I just wanted to kind of show that to you all before we leave here. And otherwise, I'll say thank you for listening and for attending. And I'll leave you with our contact information in case anyone's interested or wants to follow up or come visit the farm, find our seedlings. Yeah.
All right, awesome. That was really wonderful information. Everyone, I am putting my email address in the chat one more time. So if you are interested in receiving the recording, you can go ahead and email me directly. Maybe I am.
And then I'm going to leave you all with one more thing though, actually, because I'm going to sweeten the pot here a little bit. So for those of you in the Duluth area or northern Minnesota area, here is why the tomato is so important to us. So if you visit our website, you'll find out that we are starting a pizza farm. This is an enterprise that we are creating now at the farm, with the tomato being the kind of star of the show. So we grow about 600 tomato plants. We grow tons of tomatoes every year. And, you know, kind of starting end of this season into next season, we're going to construct a building where we can start to prepare and serve pizzas to the public. And the tomato that we grow will be the sauce, the base for the sauce. And then we'll source other local ingredients from other local farms. All the other vegetables that we grow will be toppings for those pizzas. And so if you're interested in following along with that and receiving updates on that, you can visit our website.
Awesome. I'm so glad you brought that up because I was going to remind you.
Oh yeah, no, that's the whole point.
Yep.
The tomatoes become the most important crop we grow. So we really enjoy.
And for those of you who have never been to their farm, Fairhaven is just a beautiful spot. It's really idyllic. So if you get a chance, if you're in the area, definitely go check it out because it's beautiful. And I've had some of their homemade pizza. It's phenomenal. So just giving a little plug there too. So everyone, we're wrapping up for this evening. Again, I put my email address in the chat, so if you're interested in receiving the recording, please feel free to reach out. And it'll be uploaded onto our YouTube channel sometime in the next couple days. I'm out in the country, internet's not the fastest, so it takes a little while for me to do those things. But I want to say thank you again for taking time out of your day to spend it with us in this class. Thank you to John and his wife, Emily, for making this possible and providing us with all of this wonderful information. And everybody just take care. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everybody.